By 1279, the Mongols had conquered more land than any empire in human history, and they had lost to almost no one. China had fallen. Persia had fallen. Russia, Korea, Central Asia, the Middle East, all crushed under Mongol cavalry within decades. When Genghis Khan died, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe. His grandson Kublai Khan pushed further. He completed the conquest of China. He subjugated Korea. He sent fleets across Southeast Asia. He was, by any measure, the most powerful ruler on earth. Then he looked east. Across a narrow strip of sea lay a collection of islands. Japan, a civilization with no standing army in the modern sense, no siege weapons, no experience fighting the kind of coordinated combined arms warfare the Mongols had perfected across a continent. By every rational calculation, Japan should have fallen within weeks. It didn't. Not the first time. Not the second time. And the reasons why tell us something far more complicated than divine intervention. Something about geography, adaptation, military miscalculation, and the extraordinary human cost of surviving what should have been unsurvivable. The standard explanation for Japan's survival is simple. Typhoons destroyed the Mongol fleet, the gods intervened, Japan was saved. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, and built a mythology around them that would echo through the centuries, all the way to the pilots of World War II who took the same name for their suicide missions. But that explanation is incomplete. Possibly dangerously incomplete, because it gives the typhoons credit that belongs to thousands of Japanese warriors who bled on beaches, held defensive walls through impossible odds, and forced the Mongol campaign into exactly the right position for a storm to finish what humans had started. It also obscures something the Mongols themselves, elves, understood. They made serious, correctable mistakes. Mistakes born of overconfidence, poor intelligence, and a military machine optimized for land warfare being asked to perform something entirely different. We're going to examine 4 things: who the Mongols actually were as a military force, what happened during the first invasion of 1274, how Japan transformed itself in the years between attacks, and what unfolded during the catastrophic second invasion of 1281. By the end, a clearer picture emerges, not of miraculous divine protection, but of something arguably more fascinating: a civilization that refused to be conquered, and an empire that finally found the limits of its own power. To understand why Japan's survival is so remarkable, you have to understand what the Mongols actually were. Not the caricature, not the savage horsemen streaming across steppes. The reality is more impressive and more terrifying. The Mongols were the most sophisticated combined arms military force of the medieval world. By the time Kublai Khan turned his attention to Japan, his armies had absorbed the best military technology and tactics from every civilization they had conquered. Chinese engineers operated their siege weapons. Persian mathematicians calculated supply logistics. Korean shipbuilders constructed their fleets. This wasn't a horde, it was a learning organism, a military that got smarter and more capable with every campaign. They had also developed something psychologically powerful, an unbroken record of victory. Entire cities had surrendered simply because the Mongols arrived at their gates. The reputation preceded the army. Baghdad, one of the great cities of the medieval world, fell in 1258. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had stood for 5 centuries, ceased to exist in a matter of weeks. When a military force has that kind of track record, surrender becomes rational. Resistance begins to feel futile before a single arrow is fired. Japan had no such instinct for preemptive surrender. Partly this was geography. The sea crossing made the threat feel abstract until it wasn't. Partly it was cultural. The warrior class that dominated Japanese society, the samurai, operated under a code that elevated individual combat and personal honor. They had never faced an enemy like this, and that unfamiliarity would cost them dearly in the first engagement, and teach them everything they needed to survive the second. The Mongols had also sent diplomatic missions to Japan throughout the 1260s and early 1270s, letters demanding submission, tribute, and acknowledgement of Kublai Khan's supremacy. The Japanese court ignored them. Then, in 1272, the shogunate executed the Mongol envoys. That was not a negotiating posture. That was a declaration, and Kublai Khan responded accordingly. In October 1274, roughly 23,000 Mongol and Korean soldiers landed on the shores of Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu, and immediately revealed how different this war would be from anything Japan had experienced before. Japanese warriors approached the battle according to their tradition, individual champions stepping forward, announcing their lineage, seeking worthy opponents in single combat. The Mongols responded with massed arrow fire, explosive projectiles, and coordinated unit tactics. Japanese warriors fell before they had exchanged a single sword stroke. The shock was total. The Mongol forces used weapons Japan had never seen. Cast iron bombs filled with shrapnel and gunpowder fired by catapult into Japanese formations. Horses panicked. Warriors trained for individual duels found themselves surrounded by disciplined infantry working in synchronized blocks. The Japanese fought with extraordinary personal courage and were simply outmatched tactically. By evening of the first major engagement, Japanese forces had been pushed back. The landing force had penetrated inland. Kyushu's defenses were collapsing. And then, the first stroke of fortune Japan would receive. A storm moved in overnight. Not a catastrophic typhoon, but a significant maritime storm. The Mongol commanders, worried about their fleet, withdrew their forces back to the ships. During that night, the storm intensified. Ships were damaged, soldiers drowned. The fleet retreated to Korea. Here is where the mythology begins to obscure the military reality. The storm was real, but historians examining the 1274 invasion now emphasize that the Mongol withdrawal was already underway before the weather turned severe. The fleet had suffered casualties and logistical strain. The land campaign had progressed, yes, but not decisively. The Mongols were not on the edge of total victory when the storm arrived. They were in the middle of an operational calculation about whether to push further or consolidate. The storm resolved that calculation. It did not reverse a certain conquest. Kublai Khan was undeterred. He sent more envoys. Japan executed them again. The second invasion was coming. Everyone knew it. The question was whether Japan could transform itself in time. Japan had 7 years between invasions, and they used every single one of them. What happened between 1274 and 1281 is one of the more impressive rapid military adaptations in medieval history, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The first and most concrete transformation was physical. Japan constructed a stone defensive wall along Hakata Bay, the exact landing site the Mongols had used in 1274. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. The wall stretched for roughly 20 kilometers along the coastline, standing about 2 meters high, designed specifically to prevent cavalry from operating effectively at the beach. The Mongols' greatest tactical advantage was their cavalry's speed and mobility. The wall would neutralize that. The samurai understood what had gone wrong the first time. They had fought the Mongols in open terrain, where Mongol tactics were optimized. The wall would force them into confined, infantry-dominated fighting where Japanese warriors could close to sword range. The second transformation was naval. Japan developed smaller, faster ships, not designed to defeat the Mongol fleet in open water, but to harass it. Night raids on anchored Mongol vessels became a core strategic concept. One Japanese warrior, Takazaki Suenaga, documented multiple raid operations in illustrated scrolls that survive today, a remarkable primary source showing exactly how Japan adapted. These weren't suicide missions. They were coordinated harassment operations designed to keep the Mongol fleet unstable, exhausted, and anchored rather than maneuvering. The third change was organizational. The shogunate mobilized warriors from across Japan, not just from Kyushu, and established a more coherent command structure. Disputes between local lords were subordinated to the national defense mission. The psychological lesson of 1274 had been absorbed. This enemy required collective response, not individual heroism. And underneath all of this, something else was happening. Japan was praying. Ceremonies were conducted at shrines and temples across the country asking for divine intervention. This detail matters, not for theological reasons, but for what it reveals about how Japan understood the stakes. The entire society, from court nobility to peasant farmers, knew another invasion was coming. The fear was real. The preparation was real. And the religious appeals were real. Because no one was certain the preparations would be enough. They almost weren't. The second invasion was not a repeat of the first. It was an entirely different order of magnitude. In the summer of 1281, Kublai Khan launched what may have been the largest amphibious operation in the medieval world, somewhere between 140,000 and 150,000 soldiers across 2 fleets launched simultaneously from Korea and southern China. For context, the D-Day landings in 1944 involved roughly 156,000 Allied troops. Kublai Khan was attempting something of comparable scale, 7 centuries earlier, with medieval technology, across open ocean. The northern fleet arrived first, at Hakata Bay again, and immediately encountered the wall. The Mongols had no intelligence on it. Their cavalry landed and found themselves unable to maneuver. Japanese warriors on the wall's landward side could engage from prepared positions, while Mongol forces remained compressed on the narrow beach. The landing turned into a grinding, bloody stalemate rather than the rapid inland penetration of 1274. The Japanese naval harassment worked precisely as designed. Night raids disrupted Mongol fleet operations. One notable raid may have captured a senior Mongol commander, though accounts vary. The Mongol forces, unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough on land, were forced to keep their troops aboard or near the ships for weeks. The Korean and Chinese sailors, far from home in difficult conditions, deteriorated physically. Disease spread. Supplies were consumed without territorial gains to show for them. The Southern Fleet arrived in late July, finally linking with the Northern Fleet near Takeshima Island. The combined force now represented the full weight of the invasion. A decisive land assault was being planned. Japanese defensive positions were under extreme pressure, and then, in August 1281, a typhoon of extraordinary intensity struck the combined fleet. The destruction was catastrophic. Nice sources estimate that up to a third of the total force, tens of thousands of men, drowned. Ships were smashed against each other, against rocks, against the coast. The Southern Fleet, made up of river vessels hastily converted for ocean use rather than purpose-built warships, was particularly devastated. Soldiers who made it to shore were systematically hunted down by Japanese forces. Accounts describe weeks of cleanup operations as Japanese warriors killed or captured survivors. Kublai Khan attempted to organize a third invasion. He never achieved it. Political complications in Southeast Asia, resource exhaustion, and eventually his own declining health intervened. He died in 1294. The third invasion never came. Japan had survived. Here's what connects all four segments. Japan didn't survive because of one miracle. It survived because of a chain of compounding advantages, each of which required the others to matter. The geography was necessary, but not sufficient. Yes, the sea crossing was difficult. Yes, typhoon season created a window of vulnerability for any naval force. But Korea is not that far from Japan. On a clear day, you can see the Korean peninsula from Tsushima Island. Geography created an obstacle, not a barrier. Plenty of island nations have been successfully invaded throughout history. Britain was conquered by Rome and then by the Normans. Geography helps. It doesn't decide. The wall mattered enormously. Without the wall, the second invasion's Northern Fleet likely establishes a beachhead, pushes inland, and controls Kyushu before the Southern Fleet even arrives. With the wall, the invasion stalls. The troops stay on or near the ships. The campaign stretches into typhoon season. The storm finds the fleet in exactly the worst possible position. At anchor, exhausted, with disease spreading through crews who have been sleeping on ships for weeks. The Japanese naval harassment mattered because it prevented the Mongols from repositioning or resting their fleet safely. The raids weren't tactically decisive. They were strategically corrosive, slowly degrading Mongol operational capability in ways that accumulated by the time the typhoon arrived. And crucially, the Mongols made real errors. They launched the invasion late in the season, a point historians now emphasize. The two fleets failed to coordinate effectively. The converted river vessels of the southern Chinese fleet were structurally unsuited for open ocean typhoon conditions. These weren't random misfortunes. They were the downstream consequences of overconfidence, bureaucratic haste, and a strategic assumption that Japan would behave like the continental nations that had folded quickly under Mongol pressure. This pattern, an overwhelming power underestimating a geographically isolated opponent and failing to account for the gap between its continental capabilities and maritime requirements, has echoed through history. The British Empire discovered it in colonial conflicts. The United States discovered it in Vietnam and later Afghanistan. Superior military force doesn't automatically translate across every strategic environment. The Mongols were not defeated by Japan. They were defeated by a strategic mismatch they failed to recognize until it was too late. Today, Japan's relationship with this history carries its own complexity. The concept of kamikaze, divine wind, became so central to Japanese national identity that in World War II, pilots flying suicide missions adopted the name deliberately, framing their sacrifice within a millennia-old story of Japan being protected by heaven itself. That mythology, born from two storms in the 13th century, contributed directly to how Japan conceptualized its own exceptionalism. Its sense of being a nation apart, a civilization the world could not absorb or destroy. China's relationship with the Mongol period runs in a different direction. The Mongols did conquer China, completely and absolutely. The Yuan dynasty ruled China for nearly a century. And yet, within 100 years, the Mongols had become Chinese. The conquerors were culturally absorbed. Their dynasty ended by a Chinese peasant rebellion. And today, the Mongol conquest is folded into the Chinese historical narrative as simply another dynasty. The civilization survived the conquerors by outlasting them. Japan survived by stopping them at the shore. Two very different strategies, two very different relationships to the concept of national survival. The kamikaze, the divine wind, became the defining myth of Japanese national identity for the next 7 centuries. It shaped how Japan understood itself: chosen, protected, distinct. In 1281, a storm really did destroy a fleet. Warriors really did hold a wall. Night raiders really did harass a superior force into exhaustion. All of that is historical fact. But what Japan made of those facts, the story it told itself about what they meant, that is something else entirely. Every nation that survives a near-extinction event faces this question. Was it divine protection, strategic genius, geographic luck, or some combination that cannot be fully separated? Japan's answer was clear and unwavering for centuries. The gods intervened. Japan was chosen. That belief had enormous psychological power. It underwrote centuries of cultural confidence, geographical isolation as policy, and eventually the catastrophic overconfidence of the 20th century. The historical reality is messier and, arguably, more instructive. Japan survived because its warriors adapted under pressure, because its leaders built a wall, because its sailors raided at night, because the Mongols arrived late in typhoon season with poorly built ships, and because a storm arrived at precisely the moment when the cumulative effect of all those factors had positioned the Mongol fleet in its most vulnerable possible configuration. Divine intervention requires no human ingenuity. The actual story requires a great deal of it. Which raises a question worth sitting with. When nations tell stories about their own survival, do they prefer the version that credits human effort, or the version that suggests they were always going to be saved? And what does the answer to that question tell us about how they'll behave the next time they face something unsurvivable?